I'm Miguel and you're watching RPTV. RPTV's Indigenous coverage. Chiefs of Ontario address community wellness, treaty rights, and Bills 5 and C5 in Toronto. Welcome to Regent Park TV's Indigenous coverage, where we highlight local, regional, and national Indigenous issues that directly affect communities in Toronto's downtown east and beyond. Recently, the Chiefs of Ontario hosted a special media event during the second annual First Nations Community Wellness Conference at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto. The conference brought together First Nations leadership, technicians, and community workers from across Ontario to advance conversations around community wellness. The media event focused on the urgent social determinants of health impacting First Nations communities, including housing, infrastructure, education, land-based connections, and economic stability. Speakers also addressed growing concerns over the impacts of Bill 5 and Bill C5, which they say threaten First Nations sovereignty and treaty rights. Ontario Regional Chief Abram Benedict was joined by Chief Shelly Moore-Frappier of Temagami First Nation, Chief R. Donald Maracle of Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, and Kyra Willoughby from the Ontario First Nations Young People's Council. Up next, we bring you the full media conference with the Chiefs of Ontario, where our own RPTV reporter, Fred Alvarado, was on the ground asking questions.
I am Abram Benedict, the Ontario Regional Chief. Joining today, I want to thank and say I want to go to our leadership, our youth, for gathering at this conference, but also to all the participants that have joined us today, yesterday, and tomorrow to talk about to dialogue at our First Nations Community Wellness Conference. And this conference is our second annual conference that is bringing together our community leadership across this region, as well as our partners, those who are helping support wellness in community, but also our political advocates who are helping ensure and defend community, but also supporting the wellness. And I think the elder has articulated eloquently about wellness and how important that is, and the love that she has shared with us this morning. And that is a view of our leadership as the work that we do as elected leadership in ensuring that our communities continue to thrive, that there's opportunity for our youth in moving forward. And that does mean safe housing, reliable infrastructure, and community. These are all tied to the importance and the wellness of our First Nation citizens across this region, as well as the economic stability. We know that in the times that we live in now, the economy is no more important than ever. And I can tell you that as First Nations communities across this region, we have traded amongst ourselves and had an economy long before the contact of settlers. And so our people understand the importance of economic stability and what that means to our nations, but also what that means to being equitable partners in the world that we live in today, as well as the respect that is needed and commanded around ensuring that we're moving together. And education is extremely important in so many aspects, in ensuring community wellness, but also wellness of the nation in which we live in, Turtle Island, and the shared territories that we have. And reflecting upon the systems that support all of that and the wellness. And it's important that we're working together, moving together, but also embracing our culture and language, the teachings that we have from our elders, but also reminding ourselves of the sacred responsibility that we have as First Nations people. And that's in the work that we do, supporting our nations, but also defending the territorial jurisdictions that exist amongst our rights holders, and that of the communities of the 133 First Nations across this region. And we know that the issues that impact our communities are great. Sadly, when we talk about the social determinants of health, our region has one of the most boil water advisories across Canada, which continues to be unacceptable. And we continue to support our leadership in finding solutions, but also embracing our elders and our knowledge keepers in the work that we do around that. Now, Western technologies and approaches don't always work, and we know that, but we embrace and we ensure that the work that we're doing encompasses our sacred teachings, and that includes around finding solutions around the boil water advices and building up community capacity. Today, we cannot separate the conversation on wellness, that of the threats that have come amongst our nations across Turtle Island, and more particularly here in Ontario. That is of Ontario's Bill 5 and the federal government's Bill C5, and the attack on community sovereignty that has brought about in the last couple months. Extremely unacceptable in so many fashions. in the era of truth and reconciliation, in the era of ensuring that we want to make sure that our communities have safety and security, but then having the legislative threats amongst our communities as a direct assault on the sovereignty and jurisdiction that our nations hold is unacceptable. Bill 5, through its processes, have been a process that I would categorize as undemocratic, a process where both bills, and frankly C5 and Bill 5 in Ontario have moved at extreme paces that all Canadians, all Ontarians should be concerned about. You know, the government has used the threat upon the sovereignty and the threat upon the economy. The reasons why I spoke about the economy and sovereignty is so important to our people. We understand what that means. Frankly, our sovereignty and economies have been attacked by the settlers since contact, and we understand how important that is. But taking the approach that we've seen in Bill 5 and C5 is unacceptable. We know that the governments are now, scrambling a bit to do consultation, and what that consultation means to them is completely different than what it means to us. The realities in community is not of the same. But again, today we're here to talk about the wellness of community, what all of these political, geopolitical, social determinants mean for our communities, and the impacts that has on the wellness of community. And so as we move forward, we see governments, again, scrabbling to consult with our communities, consult with our leadership. This morning I had an interview talking about the first 100 days of the Carney government, what that looks like. And they asked about what should have been done different. And what should have been done different is that when the government thought about introducing legislation to fast track projects, the First Nation rights holders should have been at the table from day one, and not after the fact, and not when all rest of Ontarians and all Canadians are available to make submissions to legislation. We are not of the same. We are rights holders. The 133 First Nations in this region are rights holders, and that is a distinction that makes our communities have in comparison to all Ontarians and all Canadians. And so today, as we move forward, regulations for the special economic zones and the Ontario Heritage Act are being done, and I would argue that they're being done haphazardly. They're announcing these consultation sessions and asking people to come to these sessions. For many of those economic zones, we know very well that the Ring of Fire is an area that the government wants to develop. But they're holding their consultation sessions down here in Toronto, perhaps even as far as Thunder Bay. But I can tell you that for the 49 communities north of Thunder Bay, that's unacceptable. The regulations, those who are doing the consultation, need to happen in community with the rights holders, including the rights holders in the south as well, not having to travel to the city centers to be able to do that. The rights holders in this region are being left in the dark when it comes to these consultation measures that are happening with respect to Bill 5 and C5, including, again, the Canadian One economy, which the government is overriding the jurisdiction in First Nation communities, which is unacceptable. And we will see, the results of that in the coming months when the rubber hits the road around project development. When the government thinks that they can assert their jurisdiction through First Nation territories, they're going to be sadly mistaken. That's not what's going to be happening. First Nation rights holders have to be at the table, and my colleagues joining me here today will talk about that a bit more in depth and those impacts, but also what those opportunities are. First Nations are not against development. First Nations, and again, we're here for a wellness conference. Wellness is a holistic approach, and that includes creating opportunities, jobs, the economy, bringing about sustainable economies to our communities is extremely important. So I do want to emphasize as we talk about the number of issues that impact us today, is that it's important that the government understand that fiduciary responsibility that they have to the rights holders. Section 35 of the Constitution upholds First Nation rights, which is this distinction that our people have. And that's not the Constitution, while it recognizes that, those inherent rights have always been there. And our First Nations exercise that. And the government must understand their fiduciary responsibility to the First Nation rights holders in this region and frankly, across all of Turtle Island. So again, thank you so much to everybody for joining us this morning. I want to acknowledge again our panel here. Everybody has joined us here at our wellness conference, our second annual wellness conference. We have lots of great information being shared today. Lots of leaders, folks are in the room and sharing their ideas, but also talking about the realities, again, that impact our communities in so many ways. but we're continuing to chart the course for the wellness of our folks, of our nations, of our citizens, and for those children that have yet to come. So, I'll go for the opportunity and thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it over now to Chief Shelly Moore-Frappier.
Which? So quickly, Giwe no kwe Indigenous Casa de Canodam, Temagami Anishinaabe kwe and Dao. I'm Chief Shelly Moore-Frappier. I am the Chief of Temagami First Nation, and I want to talk a little bit about the workshop that I just came out of, and it talks about land-based and land-based healing and how important that is, because that is where, as a Temagami Anishinaabe, that positions me to the land, and that's where our inherent rights come from. They come from the land. They come from our existence and in relationship with the land for, in Temagami, we have it recorded to like 7,000 years. So when we have that long relationship with the land, sorry, my voice is a little not cooperating with me right now. When we have that relationship to the land, you can't separate us from that. And that's where our healing comes from. So when we're talking about wellness, it's how we are in relationship to the land and with each other. And essentially that's where our inherent rights come from. Only we have those rights because of that relationship. And I think that's really important to understand as we move forward, because First Nations have historically been excluded from the economy, and this has led to adverse health disparities across the province. And when we're looking at things like Bill 5, Bill C5, and what that's doing and how that's moving forward without consultation, which was already been said, it seems almost farcical, because what that does, what these bills are doing, is removing us from the land, and that is going to be detrimental to our people. We have youth, up on the Attawapskat River, looking and protecting the land and taking their responsibility to the land very seriously, because as citizens of our nations, we both have rights and responsibilities, and that our responsibility is the stewards of the land, and that's we take that very, very seriously, and to the good points that ORC has made, that there will be disruption when things start to move forward. And how is that going to be community wellness? Like, this is when we are threatened in this way, that's going to have great impacts on who we are as communities, who we are as nations, and what does that mean moving forward. Get back here. Talking about economic reconciliation. This is not economic reconciliation. This is economic coercion when we're looking at Bill 5 and Bill C5. They're pushing us into a spot where we have no other way forward but then to resist, right? So the consultations that are now happening are almost farcical. These are technical kind of conversations that are happening in consultation, or what they're calling consultation or engagement. I'm not even sure at this point. These are not things that are meaningful. We need a meaningful relationship with the Crown. And when things are done to us, that has a huge impact on our wellness, on our ability to participate, and putting us into a position where we're not equal. And we should be at the table. We should have been there before. They had the opportunity to do some kind of consultation with us, because that was the promise of pushing this through, was the consultation part. And it's, like I said, it is farcical. And there's nothing that is going to be really meaningful about that. So, so that is threatening by steamrolling our inherent jurisdictions with First Nations sovereignty. These laws do not offer the economic stability for First Nations or Ontarians. To the contrary, they are threatening it. So right now, with mining being at the focus of the economy, we really need to bring it back to the rights holders, and that's the First Nations that are dealing with the land right now. And we want to be a part of prosperity. We need to be a part of it. We need to have the opportunity to develop a middle class in our community, so that we can begin to thrive and enjoy the wellness that the rest of Ontario and Canada does. So so we have so instead of First Nations, give us the respect that we need. Give us the respect that we need to move forward together, because that's what we really want to be doing, is moving forward together. Not this top-down approach of telling us what is going on in our own homelands, because that is not a way to move forward together. That is not a way to build respect. It's not a way to build wellness in our communities. And we should be reframing our conversations. So if we're reframing our conversations about economics to include health considerations, we work to ensure First Nations and all Canadians have a healthy and prosperous future ahead. So I'll leave it at that. Butch.
Chief Maracle, we'll turn it over to you.
Sego Sewaguego, Adarotorio Yonyats, Renata Yuni. My name is Chief Don Maracle, and I'm a member of the Wolf Clan. So there's a lot of very valuable information shared at this conference, and one of the things that stood out to me was that how there's so much work that's not been done yet, and the situation becomes more and more grave the longer it's neglected, both in terms of basically health infrastructure like housing and safe drinking water. The Assembly of First Nations report in 2023 indicated that there was a need of $349.2 billion needed to close the infrastructure gap between First Nations and other non-First Nations in Canada. Canada continues to advance the prioritization of the economy, as already spoken to by both the Regional Chief Abram and Chief Shelly, of the Bill C-5 and Bill Canada Act, prioritizing critical projects that are in the national interest, and they fail to address the basic foundational needs of First Nations communities for infrastructure. The position of the Chiefs is very clear. Before pushing forward with the national designated infrastructure projects, Canada must ensure First Nations have access to very basic health infrastructure services. Without this, First Nations cannot fairly participate in the so-called critical projects. Canada cannot expect First Nations to sign on to new national projects, critical projects, without first ensuring that First Nations have the basic needs and basic infrastructures that set us up for success and allows us to participate on an even footing in the economy. Basic infrastructure includes safe and adequate housing, clean water, reliable and health education facilities, all-season roads, digital connectivity, and climate-resilient infrastructure. The need across, and it's already mentioned, there is 26 out of 26 boil waters in First Nations communities, in 27 communities, In housing, 27 units are urgently needed and 20,000 need repair in the province of Ontario. The lack of infrastructure in each of these areas contributes to poor health, reduces educational success and opportunity. It leads to social inequities, interaction with the justice system, and it causes many disparities that First Nations now face, and many of them result in mental health issues as well. The gap in these sectors directly and deeply contribute to First Nations wellness and is the leading cause affecting many problems that our First Nations suffer across this region. Overcrowding on reserve remains prevalent and is directly correlated to poor health outcomes. Proven relationships between mold present in the houses on reserve and the development of respiratory conditions, increased transmission of infectious disease, influenza, gastroenteritis, tuberculosis, and COVID-19 are some of the problems. Overcrowding also affects education and employment. Indigenous youth who have adequate housing are more likely to attend school and have success in education. However, if they lack these services, many of them will drop out of school. Better education leads to higher incomes, food security, access to health care, and it reduces access to social services, the need for social services, and interaction with the justice system. As outlined through the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, a report called Claiming Power and Peace, it was noted that the lack of land, housing, financial resources are direct causes of the struggle faced by many First Nations women. And to recap again, Ontario Housing needs $225.8 billion to close the gap for Ontario alone, and for including infrastructure, the gap increases to $59.9 billion. Overcrowding is occurring in both residences on and off the reserve and lead to higher rates of household violence, interaction with the justice system, gender-based violence, and the decline in physical and mental health. Providing safe and healthy housing relies on adequate funding. Without access to safe and healthy housing on the reserve, First Nations Ontario will continue to face detrimental conditions that do not allow First Nations youth and learners to realize their full potential and overall to maintain the health of the community. Another ongoing crisis is the lack of access to clean drinking water. And Carolyn Bennett said many years ago that the access to safe drinking water is a human right. And Canada is lagging behind, and so is Ontario, in implementing this basic human right. This is not a new issue. It is a result of decades of neglect by both of underfunding and the absence of meaningful action on the part of the government. It takes political will to change this. Access to clean drinking water is not only a matter of public safety, but also an issue of justice. And it should be a priority for both the federal and provincial government as they seek to strengthen Canada and the economic situation of our country. The implementation of these projects will also contribute to the economic strengthening of our country. The goods and services that are produced in this country will be used in those infrastructure projects. Prior to the prorogation of Parliament in early 2025, Bill C-61, First Nations Clean Water Act, was making its way through the legislature. The bill addressed the critical and long overdue need to ensure access to clean, safe drinking water for First Nations communities. In addition, closing the infrastructure gap reintroduced and passed Bill C-61 as soon as Parliament resumes in September. A meaningful and necessary step toward correcting historic and systemic inequities. Yesterday at the Wellness Conference featured a keynote speaker from Finland, where they operate a non-profit landlord organization. They outlined the ways that Finland has used to manage to almost entirely eradicate homelessness. There's a good example that Canada should look at there to implement homelessness because it requires state significant contribution to end that problem. They use a housing first principle which is guided by the idea that housing is part of human rights and a fundamental human right. Finland's implementation of this model has been guided by national homeless programs and have produced more affordable housing, hired and trained housing professionals, established the use of experienced experts and homeless workers, and investment in preventing homelessness. As we see, Finland eradicating homelessness is indeed possible and proves to provide substantial savings to the government as well. We urge Canada and Ontario to work with the First Nations to explore ways in which we can adopt the housing principle first. The idea is there, the money is there, what is needed is the political will. Ultimately, ensuring equitable access to housing, clean water, education, healthcare infrastructure is a Crown responsibility. It's a matter of rights, justice, and reconciliation. Only then can we talk about building a stronger Canada and make strides toward a meaningful working relationship at all levels of government, including First Nations, as legislation such as the Canada's Bill C5 and Ontario's Bill 5 move forward. The need for housing and safe drinking water and the basic infrastructure for safe schools, internet, safe roads, climate change is happening in the north, and they no longer can rely on ice roads year-round. The backlog of moldy houses is affecting the health and safety of the people in our community, and it's depriving our young people of a healthy and prosperous future. And all Canadians should be concerned about this and put pressure on both governments to do something about it. And I thank you for listening to my words. Young Goa.
Yeah, Chief Maracle. And I'll turn it over to our Ontario First Nations Young People Council representative, Kyra Willoughby.
Bonjour everyone, Mino Gajep, good morning. Miigwech, and thank you for welcoming me here today. Kisia Sobek Indigenous Makwane Dodem, Wabadalgam Ninduji. My name is Kyra Willoughby, and I'm a proud representative of the Ontario First Nations Young People's Council, and I'm here representing my home community of White Sand First Nation. I'm a recent master's graduate from the University of Victoria in the Social Dimensions of Health program, and in my research on community health and wellness, I had the privilege of working with elders and knowledge keepers from my home community. I was guided by the Anishinaabe ways of knowing and being, and my research sought to answer the question, how do elders and knowledge keepers in White Sand First Nation define community wellness? The teachings that they shared with me revealed four main themes, and these were culture, land, community, and spirituality. I organized these themes in a medicine wheel which reflects the balance that we need as Anishinaabe people. These teachings remind us that wellness is not just the absence of illness or the presence of healthcare services. It's about the relationships that sustain us, the relationships that we have with our language, our lands, our families, our ancestors, and our generations. But as young leaders, we see the challenges ahead. Too many of our communities live under long-term boil water advisories, and too many of our languages remain at risk. And now, with Ontario's Bill 5 and the federal C5, we are facing legislative threats that erase our voices and erase our sovereignty. Wellness, true wellness, cannot exist without clean drinking water. It cannot exist without safe housing, quality education, reliable infrastructure, and systems that reflect who we are as First Nations people. These are the social determinants of health, and right now, the governments are failing to uphold them. As youth, we refuse to accept a future where our voices are excluded from decisions that shape our lives. We are not passive observers, we are innovators and have an inherent responsibility as caretakers of our nations. Governments keep calling these projects of national interest, but how can we truly partner with the Crown when our basic needs aren't even being met as treaty partners? Until the government honors their treaty obligations and upholds our rights, there truly can be no partnership. Because without sovereignty, there is no wellness, and without wellness, our people cannot thrive. Regent.
You know, for that, thank you to all of our leadership this morning. We'll now take questions from the media. We'll ask Isaac to facilitate that for us.
We'll start with our media here in person. Do we have any questions from any of our participants here today?
Hello, Martin Trainer, CBC News. Cultural, land, community, and spirituality. So those are the things that you were talking about. But it seems like such a huge thing when you've got all these political boulders ready to fall on top of you. How can you actually defend your own personal space, your gut? There's a psychological effect that really affects your digestion and whatever it might be. Well, what's that doing for places like Attawapiskat, for instance? You know, like the things like the suicide rate, this kind of thing. Can you explain any of those a little bit to those of us living in the cities, for instance? If that's not too much, actually.
Well, I can't speak directly on behalf of the community. What I can talk about is the impacts, that these have in communities abroad, right? And I think that, for many folks in the city centers, they take for granted the access that they have to clean drinking water, to, in the best of times, affordable, safe housing. I think that sadly there probably is a demographic of Ontarians and Canadians that actually don't have access to that, which I would think that probably are not being considered in many policy decisions either. And so for First Nation communities, that's a very small consideration in many of the aspects that impact their daily lives and the wellness that they have in community. And so when we have homes that are overcrowded, homes that are unsafe, unclean, no access to clean drinking water, health facilities, we've seen community health facilities be flooded out in the last several months. Schools, we've had continuously see schools that are inadequate, overcrowded as well. The facilities are sometimes not functioning to what standards would be acceptable. All of these factors impact the wellness of community and the children. And sadly, in our region, there are children that have grown up and now are adults, have always had to boil water or always had to go to other sources for clean drinking water. And I can tell you that, many non-Indigenous or in fact people that live in the city center could never fathom. We've seen where major infrastructure has failed in blocks, whether it be electricity, whether it be clean drinking water, whether it be internet, and the outcry that happens around that. Imagine communities that faces that every day. And so to think that the wellness is and those factors don't impact the wellness of community, that's reality. And it is unacceptable. And so we continue to make sure that government is living up to their fiduciary responsibilities, their treaty obligations. I'm happy that our youth reminded us that as well. That in partnership, these standards are unacceptable. And so that's just a high level of communities like you have mentioned are dealing with on a daily basis.
Okay, great. I'll now turn to our reporters on Zoom. Do we have any questions over there? I don't see any questions on Zoom, so I'll turn it back here in person. Do you want to do a follow-up?
Well, I can keep on going for a little bit if you don't mind. But this is your second conference. But where does the rubber hit the road, as someone's saying? Like, you got huge problems, but then you got very personal problems as well. I suppose they're very far apart. But I'm still talking about the communities such as Attawapiskat, like things like the suicide rate, this kind of thing. Is that the sort of stuff you're trying to get into? Like, like nutrition, all these kinds of things. So how does that come about?
Well, I think the conference is not going to provide those solutions and those policy decisions or those resources needed for those communities. The conference that we have today that we're attending will be about sharing best practices, creating the linkages between communities, learning from other parts of our region or perhaps other nations that have had practices that have been successful. And that is the design of the conferences, the information sharing techniques, training for our community's capacity building as well. And so that is what is happening here, and this is our second conference. If you take a look in the room, and I can tell you that it is predominantly frontline folks who's attending this conference, not the political leaders. There are some leaders through the room, in which two I'm joined here with today. But really, it is about building capacity and ensuring that we are sharing the knowledge amongst our nations to support community development. When we talk about some of the the resourcing issues, those definitely are the conversations that we're having with our leadership at our regional meetings that we have on a regular basis, or ad hoc committee meetings that are happening on a regular basis as well.
Thank you. So we have a question here in person, and Colin will go to you on Zoom right after.
Yeah, Fred here with Regent Park TV. My question is, with the Bill 5 and C5 now passed and the youth calling for direct action to challenge these laws, what role can non-Indigenous allies and urban communities play in supporting First Nations leadership as you address the impacts of these bills and work toward youth wellness and community safety?
Great question. So we have, as the Chiefs of Ontario, have been creating the partnerships and sharing information with other organizations who are equally concerned about the approach of the government, whether it be in Ontario or the federal government. And as I outlined in my remarks earlier, there's a couple things around the democratic process that was used, or undemocratic process that was used by both governments in enacting this legislation. And I think that Ontarians, Canadians ought to be concerned about the government doing that in other areas. And frankly, it doesn't always have to be for a detriment either, right? I mean, we have, my colleague. Chief Maracle has mentioned C61. C61, very fundamentally important to our communities, was very close to achieving, royal assent, was at its last process. Took several months, co-developed, but we're calling on the government to reintroduce that legislation today. The federal government can pass legislation in 20 days. We've seen it. This is what has happened with C5. They can pass legislation quickly to support Ontarians, to support Canadians abroad. And I really think that if they can do that around this project development and securing the sovereignty of Canada, they can definitely do it in other areas. Child welfare reform is another one that we're pushing hard in this region. And so, we're talking with folks about the democratic process, but also about the environmental impacts. We know that both of these pieces of legislation give the government the ability to override important legislation that protects. Although I would say that both of the federal government and provincial government, their legislative protections were already weakened. And we have seen, in the last 10 years that the environmental protection laws have been weakened at federal level and the provincial level. Now they basically got to the point where they can veto that. People should be concerned about that. The climate change that we're seeing across Canada is a direct result of development and careless government decisions around project development. I think that when we talk about clean water, we have seen Walkerton was a failure on behalf of the government with respect to legislation, regulations protecting clean drinking water for Ontarians. The government has the ability to start developing projects in territories that have pristine water that supports the entire nation. And so I think that, as the work we do as a political organization supporting our 133 communities across this region, we're building partnerships to ensure that when it is needed, and when I think that when it's going to be needed, is when projects are announced, and that is what I referenced earlier about rubber hitting the road, and Chief Shelly Moore has talked about that as well. We'll see what happens, and that's when we'll be leveraging our partnerships that we have created with folks who are equally concerned.
Thank you. And we'll go to Colin on Zoom.
Oh, hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So has there been anything set up on the books with the provincial government just yet? I know that they said that they were waiting for the regulations to actually define some of these economic zones before starting the formal duty to consult. But what kind of conversations, formal or informal, have been taking place so far? And has there been anything more formal set up to be able to satisfy the duty to consult specifically?
So the government has announced these consultation processes that it's happening across Ontario in different parts, frankly just mostly in Toronto and perhaps in Thunder Bay. These are the consultations that they are conducting, which is inadequate. As I referenced earlier, government needs to be having conversations with the rights holders in the community, on the land, with the leadership, not in downtown Toronto in a session that's designed, frankly, for all Ontarians and all Canadians would expect. The relationship between First Nations is much more. The obligations and the responsibilities that the government have is much more from a fiduciary as well as a treaty obligation, and so that is the rollout of consultation that we have seen thus far. As you know, the federal and provincial governments are not sitting at this time. What we have heard from Ontario is that once we're done our consultation sessions, which the ones I've just described, then they will be coming to leadership, which I think is is a backwards approach, which we have said from day one.
Thank you. And we will go to Karen on Zoom as well from APTN.
Hi, thank you. I have two questions. One that you mentioned you would reach out to concerned partners and that you'd be working with them. But who are the concerned partners that you're working with? And I also wanted to ask the federal
Sorry, Karen,
government.
your connection is a bit muffled. Would you mind just repeating your first question?
Sure. Okay, otherwise I'll put it in the chat. Can you hear me all right?
It's still a bit muffled. We'll try it one more time. If not, you could put the question in the chat.
Okay. I wanted to ask, who are the concerned partners that you said that you were reaching out to and would be working with? And the second question was, have the federal government followed up at all since the First Nations Summit? They said that for staff.
Yeah, Karen, we'll just get you to pop that in the chat and then we'll return back to that question in a second. In the meantime, did we have any questions from our reporters here in person? I see none, so we'll just wait a second for Karen's question to be in the chat and then I can read that out. Oh, I see, Emily, we have a hand up on Zoom, so I'll pass it over to Emily.
Hi, thank you for taking my questions. I was just wondering, like you talk about the basic infrastructure need, and I entirely take the point about the government's fiduciary responsibility, but wouldn't having participation in equity partnership in major projects also allow First Nations to work on their own to build that infrastructure without the government being involved and having like a level of independence?
Well, definitely, I think those decisions are a community decision. I think that every First Nation in this region can make that decision. I can tell you that as being a former leader in my community, in which I will turn to the two leaders of community now that I'm joined by, we had a really hard time investing in infrastructure that the government was fiduciarily responsible to do. And so having said that, it doesn't mean that we have not made our equal share investment into those infrastructure projects that were definitely needed for the community. But those decisions ultimately are with every community to make. But where is that line that you let off the government from their fiduciary is for every community to decide. And I'll defer to the leadership that I have in the room.
Well, first of all, I guess I would like to remind Ontarians and Canadians that the land and resources that were taken from our people are almost next to nothing. The exploitation and the dishonor of the Crown and the way that those earlier agreements came about need to be redressed. There's many unsettled claims that First Nations have that impact the economy, the transportation routes, the access to the resources and land itself. There's many outstanding conversations that need to happen. But governments that do care about the well-being of all the people that live in that country are concerned about the well-being of everybody. And that should include the Indigenous people, that they have a treaty relationship with. They should remember that our people went to war and fought the great causes of peace that they take for granted in this country, and there are hundreds of them in First Nations communities. That should not be forgotten in how they deal with us. The land that was taken from our people is the foundation of the wealth of everybody, that most people enjoy in this country. Without land and resources, you have nothing. And so First Nations have asked for redress of these grievances. Both the federal government and the provincial governments have lagged behind. I'll give you an example. In our treaty, we are benefactors of treaty number 3.5, the Simcoe Treaty. That exists because we were allies of the British during the American Revolution. We settled in our hunting grounds as a result of losing our villages in New York State. The 401 highway, that land was 33,000 acres, was taken from our community without a surrender when the Crown used rum to facilitate the discussion. The translator appointed by the government didn't speak any Mohawk. These are a matter of public record now and the basis of acceptance of claims. The 401 highway, the railways, the transmission lines for hydro, Canada, oil pipelines, and bridge gas lines go through that unsettled territory. We're asking for things that government should be responsible for, because there are transfer payments that come from Canada to Ontario to look after public health. Safe drinking water is a matter of public health. The government itself, through a permit system and through licensing of businesses, have caused a lot of the waterways and groundwater to become polluted. So it wasn't caused by our people, but we have the effect of it. No people can be healthy without safe drinking water or adequate housing. No matter what community it comes from, you have those conditions, whether it's neighbors or non-natives, the same will be the outcome. Dropping out of school, unemployment, interaction with the social justice, more access to the healthcare system. It'll cost more. Where housing first and safe drinking water promote more healthy people, children staying in school and become educated, they can earn their incomes. It will eliminate poverty. And the elimination of poverty will improve the health of the people. And every government should be concerned and have the political will to make that happen. Thank you.
Yeah, of course we want to be partners, but we don't want it done to us. We want to do it with us. So what does that mean? You know, that's working with us, that's free, prior, and informed consent, that is working forward together and not, again, this paternalistic approach of top down and this is what's happening. Temagami has, you know, we are in the Temagami bioregion. There's 10,000, our homeland is 10,000 square kilometers in the Temagami bioregion. We have over 14,000 mining stakes in our region. We deal with, we have one operating mine, and we have, I think about 4 advanced exploration agreements. So absolutely, we want to be partners, but we also have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to the land and of course to the people, but we are at the height of land. You know, Ishpatina Ridge, which is in our territory, is the highest part when we look at Maple Mountain. All of those pieces, like we have to take all of these things into consideration when we're talking about, you know, the water flows both ways out of our territory. So there's responsibilities that we have. So we need to be working together so that we can uphold our responsibility to the land, but also getting, you know, what comes from the land that needs to come back to us, right? And that's important. So.
Thank you.
Great. So we have time for one more question. So I'll read the question that we received from Karen in the chat here. It's a 2-parter. You mentioned working with concerned partners, and you will be working with them. Who are the concerned partners? And the follow-up, the Fed said the First Nations Summit was the first step in consultation. Has there been any follow-up on what they will do for further consultation.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that, and putting that in the chat. Some of the groups that we have been in conversations with and will be, advancing different ways to work with them are environmental groups and justice groups that exist across, not only in Ontario, but across Canada and internationally. On the other question, the government has said they'll produce what we heard report, and we have not seen that what we heard report. It really is incumbent on the government now to ensure that they are meeting their obligations as required in project development as well as being the government. I just want to say one thing around land and the development. I think that for many folks, Ontarians and Canadians, there's a lot of legacy companies that exist in Canada and exist in Ontario. And those legacy companies have been transferred, to successors or shareholders in different ways, and have obligations. Hudson Bay, a company that's been around for a very long time, and has ownership structures that are an obligation. And so let's not forget that those obligations that government has is the same thing. And those obligations are through the treaty obligations that they have made, the agreements that they have made with First Nations communities across Canada in exchange for something. And exchange has been for the use of those lands for different resources. And so the reason why I talk about Hudson's Bay, albeit there's a history in itself, but it's a legacy that happens. These are very similar to long-lasting agreements that Ontarians and Canadians can relate to. Trust agreements, 100-year trust agreements. What happens after 100 years turns into another 100 years. And those obligations continue to be the same. Those are the same obligations that federal government has to First Nations. They signed treaties for the use of resources in exchange, and that is the fiduciary responsibility that the government has. Some will argue that time has passed, but is the same in comparison to trust agreements and companies that have been around for a very long time, frankly, many generations. And so when we talk about responsibilities, it's very similar to that, although because we have in treaty and obligations, there's two partners. There's the First Nation who has continuously upheld their part of the obligation, and federal government who has failed. And that is why our First Nations continue to remind government of their responsibilities as being a signatory to treaty. So,
Thank you, RC. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for our panelists for joining today.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit us on all our social media platforms. Please visit our website for more information.